The NBA draft order is set after the Atlanta Hawks won the lottery, and I'm going to tell you why the results are a game changer for the New Orleans Pelicans and why it makes a Brandon Ingram trade even more likely. It's a Monday episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Monday. We got a week's worth of shows, and we're going to have a lot to cover after the NBA draft lottery was set. Atlanta defying the odds, 3% chance to get the number one overall pick. But if you want Brandon Ingram gone or a trade for Trae Young, Dejounte Murray, this is good news for you and the Pelicans, and we're going to break it down in today's episode and throughout this week of Locked On Pelicans as well. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by PrizePicks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use code all lowercase LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We are the number one Pelicans podcast covering everything you want. Why this was a real big Sunday for the Pels in terms of that draft lottery getting set. So become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday. And if you are an everydayer, thank you so much. Let me know in the comments down below. Thinking about doing, by the way, a live show on Wednesday night, probably at 6 p.m. Central, TBD on that, but that's kind of what I'm feeling here this week. So let's get into the Atlanta Hawks news. The Hawks getting the number one overall pick. Why do you care? You care because it's important to the Pelicans, and this opens up a lot of possibilities for what Atlanta wants to do, and they're already kind of a prime trade target for New Orleans with Brandon Ingram. Both teams feel like they need to make some sort of change. And well, this just means that that change is much more likely to happen. I don't think this is a team that's going to keep both Trae Young, Dejounte Murray, and add likely Alex Sarr, the number one overall pick, and just try and run it back. I think this is a team that realizes they need to make bigger changes in that no matter what, even when you add the number one overall pick to the mix, that guard pairing of Young and Murray just didn't work. So one of those guys is still likely to get moved. I also think that if you get the number one overall pick, it makes it even easier to sell your fan base on moving on from a guy like Trae Young. So whether you like Young more or Murray more, both are really on the table right now. And both have pluses and minuses for the Hawks and for New Orleans as well. And we'll do deeper dives on both of these players in the future. We don't need to jam it all in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. One of the things to keep in mind with the Atlanta Hawks too is they likely want to avoid the luxury tax. That team has gotten a little bit expensive and they're just not getting the results that they want. And when you look at them from a couple of years ago making a run to the Eastern Conference Finals, they had a whole lot of luck in there. They went up against the Knicks in the first round. That was just the right matchup for them. Then they beat a Philly team with just Ben Simmons, who was, I don't want to say a joke, but felt washed in that series. And then they got a little bit lucky against the Milwaukee Bucks. But they probably thought they were further along in their rebuild kind of towards contention than they were. So they make that move from Murray. And now we've seen enough to be like, yeah, that definitely wasn't it. So what they're likely looking to do is break up that backcourt pairing and then add kind of, you're building around three positions then. Your big man, which is going to be the number one overall pick, in Alex Sarr, right? Like that's who's going number one to them, I would assume. And more on the number one overall pick here in a minute. I think that's who's going to go number one overall here. Then you're going to build around a wing, Brandon Ingram, let's say, and then one of your guards, Murray or Young. That makes a whole lot more sense than two guards that don't work and a big man. Get some better wing play and see what that does for you. And I think that is the direction that you're going to see Atlanta go. If they make a trade with New Orleans, it's going to be for one of those guards. They can go either way with this. If you trade Trae Young for Brandon Ingram, then you can do that deal straight up, and you would need some picks and some other things probably on the Pelicans' end to truly make that work. That actually lowers the tax bill for the Atlanta Hawks a little bit. Maybe that makes that look a little bit more appealing. Maybe the Pelicans kind of want to keep their defensive identity, though, and they go for Murray, who is a guy that didn't play well defensively in Atlanta, but previously is one of the better defensive guards in the league. That maybe is the route that you want to go. That one is a little bit more cost-saving for New Orleans. Both of those guys, it's worth pointing out, are on long-term deals as well. So you have some just safety with them. Trae Young and Murray on long-term deals. Murray is probably slightly underpaid when you look at what some of these contracts are going to get. Next year, he's going to make, it's the first year of his extension, he's going to make $25.5 million. It culminates with a $31.6 million player option in 2027, 2028. So you have 3 years of team control over him. He'll certainly opt out of that player option in that final year, barring some sort of injury or something like that. Trae Young's a little more expensive. You've got him for 3 years, though. $43 million next year, $46 million after that, $49 in 2026, 2027. But you have time to really kind of build with him. And as a guard, and more on this when we really do a show on him, his three-point shooting isn't exactly what you think. You think of him as like a sniper, an elite three-point shooting guy. But he's a 35.5% career shooter from deep. The thing is, he does it on a large number of attempts, over 7 per game, and teams and players respect his ability to shoot and the fact that he's a threat to shoot. You don't have to be an actual elite three-point shooter to have court gravity and to bend defenses. Trae Young definitely does that. Also very good at just kind of running an offense. He can also get downhill and get to the basket and draw free throws as well. So this is the type of guy that I think would fit New Orleans really, really well. Same for Murray. He's a better rebounder than Trae Young is. He's a better defender by a large margin than Trae Young is. But it depends on what you're looking for. Are you looking for offense? Are you looking for more of a combo mix? I lean towards Trae Young in this situation here, but Murray I think would also be a very good fit. And if the price is right, sometimes it's about just kind of capitalizing on the best deal. And that's what I think this represents. Of note, with the number 1 overall pick, I don't see a world, and I can't even figure out a trade where this would make sense either, where the Pelicans get the number 1 overall pick and send out Brandon Ingram. I don't think Atlanta would do that. That would make them so unbelievably expensive that I think that would be a problem for them and probably not the direction that they're going to want to go. But I think Atlanta jumping up to number 1 overall makes a Trae Young trade even more likely than it was before. So let me know. Let me know 2 questions. Are you in favor of trading with Atlanta, sending out Brandon Ingram? And of the 2 players we're talking about here, Trae Young and Dejounte Murray, do you like one of those better than the other? There's also a guy like Clint Capella that could get put into a trade. Onyeka Okongwu, the Pelicans were linked to him at the trade deadline as well. There's lots of ways to get a deal done here, particularly if they're drafting a new big man, a new starting center. And so I think this is one of those situations where it worked out really, really well for the New Orleans Pelicans, even if they weren't the one jumping up to the number 1 overall pick. There's another team, though, that I think maybe is a very, very, very likely trade partner for the Pelicans, and that is the Detroit Pistons. Let's look at what happened to them in the lottery. They had some bad luck, and I think that means they're going to be calling New Orleans about Brandon Ingram right away. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is America's #1 fantasy sports app with more than 3 million members. It's the easiest and most exciting way to get in on the action while you watch your favorite sports and players. And it's super simple. You pick more or less on the stat projection for 2 or more players, and then you watch the winnings roll in. So get in on the playoff action and win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks, 100 times, as the world's best players take the game to a new level during basketball's postseason. Now you can win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10 into $1,000 with basketball, hockey entries today on PrizePicks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. And PrizePicks is really simple to play. You can make your picks and submit your entry in under 30 seconds. They have quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and enormous selections of players and stat types. And that's what makes PrizePicks the #1 fantasy sports app. So download the app today. Use code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. That's a first deposit match up to $100 when you download the app today and use promo code LOCKEDONNBA over at PrizePicks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy with PrizePicks. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We are here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this New Orleans Pelicans team, looking at how they kind of relate to other teams around the league as we're looking today with the NBA's draft lottery being set and that really impacting New Orleans. And we'll get into trades for specific players. We're going to do a trade target Thursday. It'll probably be the live show Wednesday night as we do that. And then we'll do a bonus segment after the fact. But this is why you come to Locked On, right? You don't want to go to Fox Sports, ESPN, other places. You got to just turn down the volume with all the shouting, or they're just not talking sports and giving you the info that you want. So you can avoid all of that by making the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the yelling. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right. Let's keep talking about the NBA draft lottery because I think it went well for New Orleans if you're looking for trade partners and getting a deal done. One of the other things that happened was the Detroit Pistons, despite having the worst record in the league, fell 4 spots down to 4. That is the maximum that you can fall. Literally 4 teams behind them essentially jumped up. 3 teams behind them jumped up. It was about as bad of a thing for the Detroit Pistons as could have occurred. And I love it because that means they're much more likely to do a deal. This draft is weak. I like Alex Sarr as the #1 overall pick. There's a couple of other guys I like enough in that range, right? Even if I don't know they're going to be like great fits for New Orleans here when it comes to things. Rob Dillingham I like with the in the top 5 as well. There's a couple other players too. But 5 for Detroit ain't it. When you have a young team like they do, and now you're picking 5th again when you were hoping for more, and there really isn't a game-changing player at 5. There might be a nice player at 5, but there's not going to be a guy where you're like, oh, heck yeah, that's who we're going to now build around. They got to do something. They want to win. That is a mandate from ownership that they want to try and win now, especially after the disaster of a year that they had with how many straight games did they lose? It was rough. They don't want that. That was embarrassing for them. So they're likely going to go and try and get a player with some all-star like ability in him to try and elevate that team. They're absolutely looking to do this. I've talked to Ku Cahill, our Locked On Pistons host, and he has said the same thing. I went on Locked On Pistons. I think that show, you should go listen to it, is more relevant now than at any other period of time. But they're going to look to try and win and be competitive next year. Brandon Ingram makes a ton of sense for them, right? Trae Young, Murray makes a ton of sense for them too. Any of those players that are potentially going to be on the move make a lot of sense. But I think they'd like a wing. They'd like an elite wing like that. Not that Ingram's an elite wing. And all of a sudden now I think they are looking at Brandon Ingram as their probably #1 guy. You can do a deal where the 5th pick is included in a trade for Brandon Ingram because the 5th pick here you don't view nearly as valuable as the #1. Had they landed the #1 overall pick, even top 2, I don't think they do this deal for Brandon Ingram. Now, 5, absolutely, I think they're very interested in this. And there's ways you can make a deal done, get a deal done. And you could probably pry a good, interesting young player. Did you like Jaden Ivey from a year or 2 ago? You could probably go and get him, though I don't think he's going to be that good. Jalen Duren, the center for them, I think makes some sense as a springy big man that is a very good defender and can give you some block shots, can give you a lot of rebounding too, and work well in the pick and roll and maybe be a big man that you could put alongside Zion Williamson. Not a stretch five by any means, but he's young. He's not going to even be 21 when the season starts, and maybe you can mold him into something. You do that, and then just salary. I think for Brandon Ingram, you can get this deal done. You might need to give up the 21st overall pick that the Pelicans have here. I think that's fine. Brandon Ingram in 21 for salary filler Jalen Duren and the 5th overall pick, I think is something that New Orleans would really look at doing. You could then potentially add your point guard in Rob Dillingham to this team, get a starting center to pair next to Zion Williamson, and start Trey Murphy all in the same move. That makes a lot of sense. Your starting lineup would likely then be CJ McCollum, Herb Jones, Trey Murphy, Zion Williamson, and Jalen Duren. That's a pretty significant shakeup for the Pelicans here, and that is definitely not complacency. Is that team better? I think it fits better. TBD on some of those players that you would be getting in return for Brandon Ingram. It's certainly not at the level of a Trae Young deal or something like that, but it's going to save you some salary. It's going to give them breathing room against the luxury tax, which, look, they're still probably looking to try and avoid paying if they can. Again, I think they should pay it, but it doesn't mean they want to or they will, and that's worth keeping in mind when it comes to this sort of thing. So looking at it like that, I truly think that that's a deal that makes a lot of sense. Had the Pistons gotten the number 1 or 2 pick, different story here, but they didn't. And I think this really opens up the possibility for a trade with them. They called New Orleans about Najee Marshall at the trade deadline. They want a wing. They want a guy who's won. They want someone they can pair with Cade Cunningham. Now, Najee Marshall isn't that guy. It's just a guy they like. But could you also do a sign and trade and include Najee Marshall in this too and send him 2 players in a sense? Najee's not coming back to New Orleans. He's going to go get paid somewhere. Here's the thing with Detroit too. They know that 5th pick isn't nearly as valuable, so they know they're going to have to overpay for anyone that they want to get. They also know they're just going to have to pay anyone to be there. They have not been good. They're not a small market, but it's not one of the glamour markets in the NBA either. So I also think they would be willing to give Brandon Ingram a max deal. I think if you trade him there, they go, we're going to pay you. And I think that's something that could get this done, knowing that you trade him and then he's extended, something along those lines. It seems like it really could happen. And I think that is something that I'm really going to be watching. We'll even have Ku Cahill probably on Locked On Pelicans, the Locked On Pistons host, to really look at a trade like this and kind of what Detroit's thinking, because that is, I just think that trade makes so much sense to me. And I think that's something that would be worthwhile at doing. You get a little bit younger. You add a little bit more depth than we saw, as I had said repeatedly, that the Pelicans weren't as deep as maybe we wanted to think they were all season long. But Detroit knows they got to overpay, and they're kind of desperate. Take advantage of desperate teams. I love that. That's not something that New Orleans always does, though they do a pretty good job of it, actually. So getting out and getting stuff that makes sense, a starting center, which you have to upgrade. Right now, you have Larry Nance Jr. and Cody Zeller, right? Like, That's not going to win you very many games. And I think Zeller is probably a free agent right now. So it's not like, you weren't going to deal with him anyway, right? You have Larry Nance Jr. That's it. You need something more than that on this team. Jalen Duren gives you a center for the future. It saves you money against the luxury tax, and then it's going to let you add another piece, whether that's a guy like Rob Dillingham or some of these other players that are there in the draft that I think the Pelicans would very much like to try and go and get. All of those guys are what you're probably kind of thinking if you're that front office about what you can do here. That's pretty good. That's a very good position to be for the New Orleans Pelicans. So let's start with that right there. Which of these 2 deals do you like the most? Hypothetical deals, or which of these 2 teams do you want to trade with? Do you want one of, say, Trae Young or Dejounte Murray, or do you want that deal that I just said, the 21st pick, Brandon Ingram for the 5th pick, and Jalen Duren, and some salary filler, right? At that point, the other players don't truly matter here coming back from Detroit, because New Orleans would probably try and move them, do something along those lines with all of that. Or just waive them, depending on what it is. Let me know with those 2 kind of hypothetical teams, which one you want to see them make a trade with. I'm kind of torn. I see it makes sense for both. I'll probably come up with a final decision on this. So coming up next, there's a dark horse team, and that's the Houston Rockets. And the draft went really well for them, too. It also didn't go well for a team. We'll talk about that coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Plus, we're going to do the community mock draft and everything again this year. That's always fun to do. So we'll probably get that started soon. So if you've done that before, great. We turn them into a couple of shows here. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'll tell you how you can be involved with that. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel's giving you a shot at bringing home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. It's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Pelicans aren't in the postseason right now, but if you're watching the playoffs, make them more interesting. Take a team that you think is going to win. I'm looking at the Indiana Pacers right now. Getting them on just the money line against the Knicks, who are banged up, seems like a smart thing. And then you're going to win $150 to bet on anything else that you want when your $5 bet wins. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook and the official sportsbook of Locked On. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and join almost 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube. We are inching towards that. It's going to be awesome. We'll probably do something special and fun when that is the case here. We're going to have more coming this week on the draft, trades, all of that. I'm excited to talk about all of these things here. It's going to be a lot of fun. We are not slowing down at all on Locked On Pelicans, so please subscribe. Tell a friend about the show, too. We're here Monday through Friday, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And now for your second listen, Locked On Saints. Ross Jackson making sense of everything black and gold. Rookie mini camps. They're trying their first-round pick at a different position. There's also facility upgrades. More on that we'll talk about here on Locked On Pelicans, too. So make sure you go subscribe to Locked On Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So there's a dark horse. Before we get to the dark horse team, you look at this draft, look at this lottery and how it went, and you could kind of worry a little bit. But I actually think it went really well for New Orleans. There's a couple teams that did move up. The San Antonio Spurs grabbed the 4th overall pick. That's not ideal. The Houston Rockets moved up a couple of spots to 3. That wasn't ideal either. Those are division teams, the teams the Pelicans play the most. But I think when you look at it, they're still a little bit behind the Pelicans. They might, especially San Antonio might catch up with a guy like Victor Wembanyama. What we didn't want to see didn't end up happening, and that's a good thing. And that was the Memphis Grizzlies jumping up. They fell 2 spots. That was a team that basically just had a throwaway year because of injuries, because of suspensions to John Morant and things like that. Well, you didn't want them to get a #1 pick, a #2 pick. You wanted them to really, really fall backwards, and they did. That's a good thing. They might use that pick to trade it, but it's not going to have a ton of trade value, as we've learned. So overall, I like the way this played out for New Orleans and trying to figure out a Brandon Ingram trade that makes a lot of sense and finding ways to improve this team. That, I think, to me was really good. I'm happy that Memphis didn't jump up there. But the Rockets did. They jumped up to #3 overall, and that's not ideal, I think, for the Pelicans, but I think it's also okay. I think it can definitely be an okay thing for them because maybe there is a deal to be made. Houston really wanted to kind of get back into contention sooner rather than later. And so they had a push in terms of winning at the end of the season. They were rumored to be sniffing around at the trade deadline to try and add someone to the team to help them improve and go and contend more. Maybe that's Brandon Ingram. Could you then maybe trade Brandon Ingram for a guy like Jalen Green and the #3 overall pick? You add another guard here that you're particularly looking for, and then add someone that you want in the draft, right? That's younger. It's a little more unproven than someone like Trae Young, than Murray. He's not an amazing 3-point shooter, but he takes attempts. Like, there's ways you can kind of figure out a deal like that and see if maybe that's the direction that you want to try and go in. I don't have a problem trading with a division rival. We've seen maybe Brandon Ingram isn't the type of guy that will do it in the playoffs for you, or the type of guy that's going to fit in with some of those younger guys and things like that. So trading him to a division rival, I don't really have a big problem with. Maybe there's a way to get another player that you like in a deal like that, something along those lines. And I think that's something that could be kind of important for the team too, right? Maybe you can get a guy like Tari Eason, who I thought does pretty well for them off the bench. Maybe that would be a piece that would appeal to the Pelicans here. So Houston, I think, is a bit of a dark horse, and I'm sure they'll call. Maybe you don't want to deal with a division rival, but at the same point, you just want to try and make this team better. Is Alperen Şengün available? He's a center that makes a ton of sense next to Zion Williamson. I don't know if they're willing to move him. I would be shocked if they were willing to move him given how well he played. He finished third in most improved player this year. That said, if you could get him, I think that's maybe the type of deal that you want to look at. And I think that's something that could be appealing to the New Orleans Pelicans too. So overall, the way this draft shook out, I think was great for finding a Brandon Ingram trade. We'll look at some of the prospects. We'll look at prospects that the Pelicans could take at 21. We'll look at players the Pelicans could get at 17 because they can get that Lakers pick too. I don't think you're going to kind of package both those picks to move up, but we'll look at that. We'll look at the number 1 overall pick a little bit as well. But overall, this was a really good draft night that I think is a bit of a game changer for the Pelicans. They didn't have to do anything here. Is there a team you want to see them make a trade with? Is it Trae Young? Is it Dejounte Murray? Is it Jalen Duren? Is it Jalen Green? Maybe we'll do a live trade show. We're going to do a live show Wednesday night. That's the tentative plan right now. I'll schedule it in the system and everything so that we can interact and do that. I'll do the show, then we do the bonus segment after. So kind of put that on your calendar here. And maybe we'll look at Trae Young in that because I think Atlanta being a team to really keep an eye on if you want to upgrade like instantly with the biggest name possible, they're the team that you would look at doing that with. But this was a good NBA draft lottery, I think, for the New Orleans Pelicans. So I'm pretty happy with how this shook out, and it opens so many intriguing possibilities. So we're going to have more to come here this week on Locked On Pelicans, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So please subscribe. Join almost 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. And I'll tell you how you can get in on the mock draft and everything, the community mock draft and all that. I'll set all that up, tweet it out to you at NOLA Jake on Twitter. So we will be with you tomorrow. This has been the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. See y'all next time.